A United States Navy ship carrying more than 300 people sailed into the Atlantic, and vanished. No distress call. No wreckage. No bodies. More than a century later, the ocean still refuses to give back the USS Cyclops. By the end, you'll know what the Cyclops was carrying, why investigators rejected the obvious suspect, and which overlooked weakness may explain how a ship that large disappeared before anyone could call for help. To understand why this case still disturbs naval historians, you need to understand the scale of what disappeared. The USS Cyclops was not a fishing boat or a fragile wooden schooner. She was a steel-hulled Navy collier nearly 550 feet long, a floating industrial machine built to carry mountains of fuel for the American fleet. Her name fit her appearance. Towering amidships was a single massive smokestack, staring over the deck like the eye of the mythical Cyclops. Commissioned in 1910, she could carry roughly 12,000 tons of cargo. Cranes lined her deck. Her cavernous holds ran through the center of the hull. Fully loaded, she displaced close to 20,000 tons. This was a ship designed for weight. And in early 1918, weight was exactly what she had. The First World War was raging. Steel production consumed enormous quantities of manganese, an element used to strengthen armor, weapons, rails, and machinery. The Cyclops was sent to Brazil to collect it. She left Rio de Janeiro in February with approximately 11,000 tons of manganese ore packed inside her holds. Then she headed north toward Baltimore. On board were sailors, officers, civilian passengers, and one particularly important traveler, Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the United States Consul General at Rio. Popular accounts place 309 people aboard. Later Navy histories often list 306 and acknowledge that contemporary records conflict. Either figure makes the disappearance the deadliest non-combat loss of life involving a single United States Navy ship. Then the Cyclops made an unscheduled stop at Barbados. That stop would become the last confirmed moment of her existence. Imagine standing on the dock in Barbados on March 4, 1918. You see the Cyclops sitting low in the water under the burden of her cargo. Sailors move across the deck. Smoke drifts from the funnel. Nothing announces that you are watching a ship enter history for the final time. Yet there were reasons for concern. Captain George Worley reportedly told officials that one of the ship's engines had developed trouble. The Cyclops took on coal, gathered supplies, and prepared to continue alone toward Baltimore. There was no convoy escort. There was no emergency declaration. There was no request for rescue. Before leaving, the ship transmitted a routine message understood to mean that conditions were satisfactory. Then she passed beyond the horizon. Baltimore expected her around March 13. The date arrived, but the Cyclops did not. At first, there was no panic. Ships were frequently delayed by weather, mechanical problems, or wartime routing. Radio communication remained imperfect. A vessel could be silent for days without being lost. But one day became several. Naval stations listened for her call sign. Ships watched for smoke on the horizon. Ports along the coast checked their arrival records. Nothing. The silence grew heavier because it made no sense. Even a ship sinking in bad weather might launch boats, release floating wreckage, or transmit a hurried warning. The Cyclops gave the Navy none of those things. It was as if the Atlantic had removed not only the ship, but every trace that it had ever crossed the water. The disappearance happened during World War I, so investigators began with the most frightening explanation. Germany. A submarine could have torpedoed the Cyclops without warning. A surface raider might have intercepted her. And Captain Worley himself deepened suspicion. He had been born Johann Friedrich Wickmann in Germany before coming to the United States. Crewmen described him as harsh, unpopular, and sometimes openly sympathetic toward his homeland. Rumors spread that he had secretly delivered the ship to the enemy. Others suggested German agents aboard had sabotaged the engines, seized control, or planted an explosive device inside the cargo. It sounded plausible. But here is where the story turns. British intelligence had become highly effective at intercepting German naval communications. Allied officials could track submarine movements and compare reported attacks with missing ships. No German message claimed the Cyclops. No submarine log described sinking her. No prisoner interrogation exposed a plot. After the war, German naval records were examined. They contained no indication that Germany had attacked, captured, or even located the ship. The enemy most capable of erasing the Cyclops seemed to know no more than the Americans did. So investigators were forced to confront a stranger possibility. The threat may have been inside the ship before she ever left port. Manganese ore does not sound dangerous. It does not explode like ammunition. It does not burn like coal. But its weight can destroy a ship. The Cyclops had been built to carry coal, a comparatively bulky cargo distributed through large holds. Dense manganese ore behaved differently. 11,000 tons of it placed immense concentrated forces on the hull. And this was not a perfectly healthy vessel. Reports suggest that the Cyclops had experienced structural concerns before her final voyage. Sailors complained that the ship could roll badly. She had also apparently suffered damage before reaching Barbados, and one engine may have been out of service. Now add a dangerous detail: cargo can shift. If heavy ore was unevenly loaded, or if water entered a hold and allowed material to move, the ship's center of gravity could change. A severe list might expose openings to the sea. Bulkheads could fail. Structural members already under stress could buckle. The Cyclops was also a Proteus-class collier, a design with enormous cargo spaces running through much of the hull. Those spaces made her useful, but they may have reduced her ability to survive a sudden internal failure. Picture the ship entering rough water. A wave lifts the bow. Another drops it into a trough. The center remains burdened by thousands of tons of ore. The hull bends one way, then the other. Steel groans. Rivets pull. A seam opens somewhere below the waterline. But before we decide that weather simply broke the Cyclops apart, you need to understand something even stranger. No confirmed major storm was waiting where most people assume she disappeared. And the final position of the ship is not actually known. This is the central problem with the case: investigators never had a precise place to search. The Cyclops left Barbados for Baltimore, but no verified transmission fixed her position after departure. Any failure could have occurred close to the island, hundreds of miles north, or near the American coast. A ship moving at roughly 10 knots could cover vast distances before anyone realized it was overdue. The Navy issued notices. Patrol vessels watched shipping lanes. Coastal stations searched for survivors and debris. Reports poured in from sailors who believed they had seen floating objects, heard distant explosions, or spotted an unfamiliar vessel. None produced a confirmed trace. Not a lifeboat. Not a nameplate. Not a body. Then came the rumors. A giant wave had rolled the ship over. A mutiny had erupted. A boiler explosion had torn her apart. A poisonous gas cloud had killed everyone. A monstrous creature had pulled her beneath the surface. Decades later, writers placed the Cyclops inside the Bermuda Triangle, even though that name and its supernatural legend were created long after the ship vanished. That framing made the mystery famous. It also distracted from the physical evidence. Because the strongest clue was not a paranormal boundary drawn on a map. It was what happened to two ships built from the same plans. The Cyclops had three sister ships, Jupiter, Proteus, and Nereus. Jupiter survived long enough to be transformed into the USS Langley, America's first aircraft carrier. But Proteus and Nereus followed a darker path. Both were eventually sold into commercial service. And in 1941, both vanished in the North Atlantic while carrying heavy metallic ore. No survivors. No confirmed wreckage. No definitive explanation. 3 ships from the same 4-vessel family disappeared while burdened with dense cargo. That does not prove a shared structural failure. The ships vanished decades apart, in different conditions, and the evidence for each loss remains incomplete. But coincidence now has to compete with engineering. One theory suggests that these long colliers were vulnerable to longitudinal stress, the bending forces that act on a hull as waves lift one section while leaving another unsupported. Heavy ore could intensify those forces far beyond what coal normally produced. Another possibility is cargo shift followed by capsizing. A heavily loaded vessel could roll beyond recovery, especially if flooding began before the crew understood what was happening. Either scenario could become catastrophic within minutes. And that matters because it finally explains the most haunting detail in the title. Why there was no distress call. The most likely answer is not that the crew refused to call for help. It is that they never had time. If the Cyclops suffered a gradual engine failure, the radio operator could have transmitted a position and requested assistance. If the ship encountered a visible enemy, lookouts might have raised an alarm. If flooding developed slowly, lifeboats and debris would probably have reached the surface. But a sudden structural collapse changes everything. The hull may have fractured amidships under the combined stress of heavy ore, weakened structure, and rough seas. Water would have entered enormous open holes almost instantly. The dense cargo could have dragged the broken sections down before boats were launched. Or the ore shifted violently, forcing the ship into a fatal list. Once seawater poured through deck openings, the Cyclops may have rolled and descended with terrifying speed. Radio equipment in 1918 was not a handheld device waiting in every sailor's pocket. A distress signal required someone to recognize the danger, reach the wireless room, power the equipment, and send a coherent transmission. A ship breaking apart does not give you that sequence. It gives you noise, darkness, collapsing steel, and seconds. The weight that made the Cyclops valuable may have carried most of the evidence straight to the seabed. Wood and personal effects could have scattered across hundreds of miles or gone unnoticed during wartime. So the hard reveal is this. The absence of a distress call is not evidence of something supernatural. It may be evidence that the destruction was almost instantaneous. The Navy officially declared the Cyclops lost in June 1918. Families received no graves to visit and no final messages to preserve. They were left with administrative notices, newspaper speculation, and a blank stretch of Atlantic. More than a century of improved sonar, deep-sea vehicles, and underwater exploration has not produced an authenticated wreck. That does not mean the ship lies in an unreachable supernatural void. It may rest far outside the routes modern searchers expect. It may be buried beneath sediment. It may have broken into sections that no longer resemble a ship. And the ocean is unimaginably large. Even today, search teams can struggle to locate aircraft or vessels when they know the approximate coordinates. Investigators looking for the Cyclops do not even know which portion of a route stretching thousands of miles deserves priority. The mystery survives because the evidence required to solve it lies somewhere beneath deep water, while every human witness disappeared with the ship. No German attack fits the surviving records. No paranormal explanation is necessary. Structural failure, unstable cargo, mechanical weakness, and unforgiving seas form the strongest grounded theory. But without the wreck, theory is all we have. The Cyclops remains out there, perhaps shattered, perhaps intact, and perhaps still holding the final answer in total darkness. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, we're opening an even stranger maritime file. The Mary Celeste was found sailing without her crew. Because the Cyclops vanished with everyone aboard. The Mary Celeste came back without them.